and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and today, and like we do every month at this time, we have Rebecca Laurie on with us. She is the Director of Communications for Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies, better known as DORA, as we lovingly call it.
And, hi, Alex, and welcome.
Yeah, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's great to be here, as always.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And who are your guests today?
Yeah, so we have esteemed guest, Colorado Securities Commissioner Gerald Rome. He's the head of the Division of Securities at DORA, and we also have Matt Bouillon with the Colorado Attorney General's office. We're here today to discuss a really hot topic, fintech, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, everything like that we are going to discuss, and that's in relation to Financial Literacy Month that's happening right now.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So welcome, Jerry. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
So, yeah, happy to be here. Alex, happy to be here, and thank you for inviting us. And
yes.
We're always happy to come down and talk with you folks.
Yeah, especially about something as exciting as blockchain and cryptocurrency, right?
It really is on the front burner of what folks are doing out in that community and what regulators are looking at now. So it really is an important issue for everyone. Yeah.
So Jerry's been on before to discuss some of these topics previously, but even since that time, and I think it's only been a few months, so much has changed in the landscape of fintech. And we thought it would be great to get an update, not only from Jerry, but also from a legal perspective coming from the Colorado Attorney General's office. And, Matt and Jerry, you work closely together on this sort of stuff in the division. And so it'll be great to hear from both of you. But first, I think for all of us, because it is so new, let's get a sense of these terms and what they are first before we get into the nitty-gritty of those terms. So can you give us a quick overview of some of these terms that are used so frequently, such as what is cryptocurrency?
Well, so I can start with actually talking a little bit about financial technology.
Perfect.
Or fintech. So,
fintech.
Because, the cryptos and the blockchain is just sort of a subset of that. Mm-hmm. But financial technology is just basically computer software used in the financial services industry that tries to, generally speaking, eliminate the middleman. So, all this is, if you know a millennial or you have one in your family, they're the ones that are using this technology. So some easy examples are like the Venmo app. I don't know if you've heard of the Venmo app or the Cash app.
I have it.
There you go. And so that eliminates the need for transferring money with the bank, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a perfect example of fintech. Another one in our industry, the securities industry, is, we regulate financial advisors. People give financial advice. Well, there are companies out there now that actually set up software programs run by certain ways to do it, where you can actually interact with a robotic financial advisor. They have all your information, and you get financial advice from a logarithm. And so it's sort of eliminating the financial advisor out of that equation.
So is it like a little paperclip that pops up and says, "Can I help you today?"
Exactly. So
raise your hand if you remember that.
I'm aging myself.
No one admit to that.
Yeah. So the cryptocurrencies and the blockchains are just like that. And I'll let Matt. And just for your information, Matt's a lawyer at the Attorney General's office, and he works with us at the Division of Security. He actually goes to court for us. We have an enforcement case. We have a bad actor who we charge with violations of our Securities Act. Then we turn it over to Matt. He's sort of our pit bull in the courtroom, and he goes after the bad guys. But we're happy to have Matt here, and he actually is a little bit of an expert in cryptos and blockchains. I think he's not a true believer, but I think he's you'll find out a little bit about it.
It's so new, you can only be a little bit of an expert at this point, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly the point that I would make. First of all, is that we're not seeing the level of professionalization yet. So a lot of what we talk about in terms of the types of information that's available to people who maybe want to learn more about this technology is, generally speaking, not very good. It has historically been the province of YouTubers and armchair, aficionados, of which, I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert exactly, but definitely an aficionado or someone with that level of interest, which is easy to do in this day and age because Jerry used the example of Venmo. Mm-hmm. Venmo is something that I use and all my friends use. And it is a great application of financial technology. It also happens to be what many in the cryptocurrency space see as the old way of doing things.
Already, yes.
Right, because it is at its heart, it's an automated clearinghouse transaction, which is a system that has a legacy system that has been with us for decades. And the next kind of in a way to begin the discussion about what cryptocurrencies are, we have to look at what we currently have and the trend that has really been set in motion by the creation of Bitcoin back on January 3rd, 2009. So when Bitcoin kind of came about, that's many years passed without most people ever even hearing about it. In fact, still many people have not yet really heard about it or know much about it. But Bitcoin carried within it a kind of a revolutionary idea, which was that, rather than having a closed system where, you have to first be a customer of the bank to use it, or and the bank will only, dictate to you how many of their services you can use and in what way you can use them. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin opened the door to an open source way of doing things, where if you have the ability, you are able to, in effect, write your own software for Bitcoin to perform transactions or operations that help you in some way. And now you become the bank in a way. Mm-hmm. And that is really kind of the what was once a silo, where we think of silos as kind of like centralized receptacles of information, is now something that everyone in the entire world with a Nokia 1000 cell phone can really take part in. And so I think a lot of people are very excited about that. So
a decentralized form of moving money?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And decentralized is a word we throw around a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important to remember that it's decentralized because most of what the effort that's required to process the transaction is also the expenditure of electricity that secures the network. It takes a real world something of value like electricity, mm-hmm. and it converts it into security. That basically the trade-off there is we now have to accept responsibility for custody of these Bitcoin usually, or any other kind of cryptocurrency for that matter. And the result is that you can't really stop a Bitcoin transaction because you don't know where exactly it's processed. A particular node, as they're called, a collection of computing power that processes a particular group of transactions and adds those to adds that block to the chain, as it's called, blockchain, hence the word. All of that comes together in a really cool way with cryptocurrencies because suddenly there's nobody in between. Like Jerry said, there's a disintermediation effect. The middleman has basically been removed. And so for a lot of people, understandably, that's pretty exciting.
So we call these things cryptocurrencies, and I think when Bitcoin first came about, and Matt can correct me, but the concept was to be Bitcoin to be sort of a substitute currency for the dollar. So, for instance, you could own Bitcoin, and you have an electronic wallet, and you could go into Starbucks and buy, a cup of coffee with your Bitcoin. But I think that over time, that really didn't come about. I mean, I think you can do some transactions with Bitcoin, but I view it more as a commodity, like maybe like gold is. Like you can buy stuff with gold, but people don't really have gold coins anymore or gold bars. Which you
still need to buy with dollars.
Right. Exactly.
Or whatever the currency of the country is. So there's still real currency that needs to purchase that commodity, so to speak, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I think even the most ardent proponent of Bitcoin or any particular cryptocurrency. There are, thousands you can pick and choose. I don't even think that the most ardent supporters would suggest that this is somehow going to displace fiat currencies. Okay. Those currencies that are printed with the backing of a central government and a central bank, and that are, essentially, it sounds bad to use the word manipulation, but when the Federal Reserve decides that they want to engage in quantitative easing and they want to essentially buy large amounts of toxic assets, it's a nice way of saying printing money. And Bitcoin being deflationary, it retains that store of value property that is one of the characteristics of money, but is something that people find compelling because at minimum, we know that there are going to be 21 million total Bitcoin out there, and that there's never ever going to be any more than that. And so people use that as kind of a way to say, well, this is a scarce commodity now. And that's leaving aside the fact that we estimate somewhere between 4 and 5 million probably Bitcoin are lost forever because people lost their private keys. So that responsibility of taking custody for it, I think, is all the more pressing now that we're looking at Bitcoin 6,800. In December, we were looking at Bitcoin 20,000. Mm-hmm. To lose that is a cause for heartburn. So
I think and not to go too far down this angle, but I think one of the things that really is tough for people to wrap their minds around is why there's value to something that doesn't technically exist and how that value is determined.
Okay, well...
and why would that be considered a commodity then if it doesn't technically exist?
Well, digital money is not really a new concept. I mean, e-gold was attempted in the late 90s and it flopped, but not before it drew a lot of attention and mm-hmm. a lot of interest from people who thought that this was the next big thing. Well, e-gold was unable to solve the problem of double spending of tokens. That is the problem that Bitcoin essentially solved. That's the revolutionary development in some respects. So I'd have to push back a little bit on the not being backed by anything, although I understand why it might appear that way. In reality, there is an enormous amount of computational power throughout the world that is basically a community of individuals known as miners whose job is to supply that electricity and that computational power to secure the network. And this is not a altruistic endeavor. One of the interesting things about crypto economics is that they have basically made this about greed in a good way. The Michael Douglas famous quote, right? Not in the sense that everybody's just trying to get rich, although on the other hand, everybody is always trying to get rich. But if you give people the ability to make money, if you are able to reward that investment of computational power, which is the real expenditure of real electricity, no surprise that Bitcoin mining is particularly popular in countries with low electricity costs like Venezuela or China. It's that investment, the investment in the hardware, the actual physical graphics cards and mining hardware that's necessary to do these very, very complicated transactions or computations. In return for that electricity and that investment in hardware, the miners are rewarded with Bitcoin. So the miners always have a vested interest in the value of Bitcoin going up because that's how they're paid.
So getting back to Rebecca's question, though, I think that in terms of what, so I looked at Bitcoin today, and I think it was valued at $6,800 one Bitcoin. It's been as high as 10 and started out in the hundreds, and so it fluctuates. But the value, it has no intrinsic value in the sense that, a dollar has some sort of intrinsic value. And the price of a Bitcoin is only determined by how much someone is willing to pay for it. So it's just supply and demand.
Like a stock.
Well, no, so it's different because a stock is actually, if you buy a stock.
It's a share.
Yeah, in Google, know that Google the last 5 years has made money, and that share is worth something. Mm-hmm. But that's what's missing with Bitcoin.
Okay.
Is that backing up, and so people think it has some. Only I guess people's predictive future, what it may be worth 6 months from now is the only. I mean, it really is only worth what people are willing to pay for it. And I think that, I think that what really is important in this conversation is blockchain and ICOs, because I think the cryptocurrencies are there, but I think, at least from my point of view, and Matt may disagree, it's really, and we may disagree a lot today.
Which is all right.
I think the blockchain technology is what is going to be used in the future and really dramatically affect a lot of different industries in a lot of different ways.
So let's talk about that for a moment and some of the, kind of change agent that blockchain technology brings. Can you define that and then also get into the concept of ICOs?
Well, as a corollary of everything we've been talking about, since, I think I have to say, I think that in the developed world we lose sight of this because we have Venmo, and Venmo works just fine. We don't care that the transaction takes 3 to 5 days to settle. Doesn't matter, because in Venmo, it's settled instantaneously for our purposes. But in the developing world, where stores of value where safe haven assets are really something that are sought after, that's where cryptocurrency has in blockchain, by definition, of course, cryptocurrency being the kind of the unit for any given blockchain.
Well, why don't you explain to us just the basics of blockchain?
Well, on its most basic level, all of blockchain tries to do and wants to be is a global ledger that exists on all of the computers connected to the system at once. And so in order to spend a native unit of that software, basically, which now has a monetary value, but that's even getting ahead of ourselves. But in order for that to work, there's an ecosystem of miners, inevitably. The very first algorithm that was put out there to secure the network was the proof of work algorithm for Bitcoin. Proof of work is a fancy way of saying, I think, look at what we can do, kind of like civilizations have done throughout our history. Look at what is possible. In other words, look at all of this computational power, which is incredibly vast. I mean, you may have heard statistics about the Bitcoin network consuming the equivalent of, the nation, the Republic of Ecuador's electricity needs. That's not very far-fetched in some instances. So that is a very resource-intensive algorithm. Since then, of course, there have been developments that have made mining much less resource-intensive, so it doesn't consume quite as much electricity. But the bottom line for all blockchains is that it creates a ledger that is not falsifiable any longer because of the way that these transactions are processed. So we are not really used to talking about the concept of immutability. But what is valuable about Bitcoin? Well, the very first sentence of the Bitcoin white paper that sets out what the whole purpose of this thing talks about getting around financial institutions. Yeah. So right. The bottom line there being, of course, that unless you're able to decouple from the financial system, you're always going to experience manipulation, and fiat currency is kind of the haven where central bankers go to manipulate.
So it's interesting that you bring that up because, of course, where there's a way to make money, there's always people looking for ways to defraud that, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's talk really quickly about ICOs.
I would like to just point out that ICO stands for Initial Coin Offerings for those of you that are unfamiliar and trying to learn about the blockchain.
Thank you.
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about initial coin offerings, and it's sort of a takeoff on what we call IPOs, or initial public offerings. And many companies, what they do when they want to raise capital to further develop the company will issue shares of their stock to the public in a public offering. So, for instance, Spotify recently did an IPO. A couple of weeks ago, and so it's just the IPO is a mechanism for regular companies to raise funds. The ICOs, so you have this blockchain technology, and people creative people in this industry come up with ways that they can use this blockchain. Let me give you a quick example. I know there's a pilot project in the state of Illinois in recording real estate transactions. So we use title companies to do that, right? And so they're using blockchain as a system to keep track of real estate transactions, sort of like the blockchain uses to keep track of Bitcoin transactions. And it sort of eliminates the title companies in the middle. So people come up with these conceptual ideas, but it takes money and electricity and computational power to do that. And they say, well, we're going to. I have this concept. I need some money to develop it. What we'll do is we'll issue these coins, like a Bitcoin, but they'll come up with their own coin. And when we sell these to people who want to buy them, then we'll use the funds from those sales to develop the project that we have in mind. So if Matt could develop a company, I want to buy his token. He can name his token whatever he wants. I send him $5,000. I get a token, and that token entitles me to certain things. It could be an interest in Matt's company, like a share of stock would be in Spotify, or it could entitle me to some sort of to be able to use Matt's software on the blockchain system. So a number of ways that I can use that. But what it enables is the creative people out there to develop these concepts and raise money to sort of develop those over time.
And I did just a quick search, and there's Litecoin, there's Ethereum, there's as you were saying, thousands at this point, different types of coins to be able to solve these, not necessarily problems, but kind of the goals of the ICO, correct?
Right. And I think before the show we were talking about a company, or is it a token called Gallon?
Yes.
And so that's a perfect example of someone coming up with a concept. And maybe Matt can explain the concept in 10 words or less. So
basically, Airbnb for computer processing.
Yes.
So there you go.
Airbnb for computer processing.
Except you don't sleep in it exactly.
So can you elaborate?
Sure. Well, I mean, Jerry's right. The ICO funding mechanism has really just been incredible in terms of what it's been able to achieve. The total amounts they've raised have been through the roof. Now, naturally, there's quite a few things wrong with the current regime, but it has placed venture capital finance in the hands of the common person, is basically what it's done. So all the same limitations on investments will eventually come to apply to ICOs, I think, being that they're probably securities like Chairman Clayton said. But, they're not just about transmitting money anymore. They're often about, as in the Gollum example, who launched their mainnet today, if you have spare computing power, you can get paid to give that to others. If you have, in many other examples, if you have spare hard drive space, you can get paid to contribute that to the network. You get compensated in the tokens of that network, and then you're making money off of something that was previously being unused. Same for broadband internet. Same for any resource that historically goes underutilized.
It says here in Bitcoin Magazine, ultimately the goal for Gollum is to make just about anything that requires heavy computer lifting. Think computer-generated images, rendering, scientific calculation, machine learning, and more, both affordable and accessible.
This is one fact.
That about summarize it?
That's exactly right.
Perfect. This is a fascinating conversation. Stay with us. We will be right back here on Connect and Collaborate. Check out this podcast and more at cobrt.com/live.
AM.
Hello, and welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer. And today we are having a fascinating conversation. We are here with Rebecca Laurie, Director of Communications for Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies. And she joins us every month to bring a new and fascinating department. And this month we are talking about financial literacy. And one of the exciting things that we have stumbled upon or learned about in the last half hour at least on this show and a little bit before, is this cryptocurrency, ICOs, blockchains, right? It's trending right now. It's a very big topic. And so Rebecca Laurie brought some fantastic people with her to talk about this. So Rebecca, again, introduce us to your guest, please.
Yes, and we've been having a great conversation with Colorado Securities Commissioner Jerry Rome, as well as Matt Bouillon from the Attorney General's office. He's an assistant attorney general there, and Jerry and Matt do work together on a variety of cases that are securities related, which, given this topic right now, it is very timely for the securities regulation industry and environment to be really looking at this very critically. But, there's, as Matt so aptly expressed, there's a lot of excitement and innovation also happening. And so clearly there is a sense among regulators of not wanting to stifle, industry, but wanting to make sure that the people who are getting involved with this type of new technology aren't fleeced.
Right.
So that's what we're going to focus on in this next segment. And now that we've covered the basics, we can dig into this a little bit more. One of the biggest questions swirling around fintech right now is how or even whether some of these new technologies should be regulated. So could one of you, Jerry, probably talk about what some of the arguments are for and against this type of oversight, and specifically by securities regulators?
Sure. I'm happy to do that. Every state has a Securities Act like Colorado does, and our Securities Act tells us exactly what the purpose is, and that's to protect investors. And so, not every investment we do is risk-free. But the way the securities laws are set up is that the people who are selling securities have to give you full disclosure of the benefits and the risks of making those sorts of investments. And it didn't used to be that way. At the turn of the century, there were no such thing as securities laws. It was like totally the free market, and it was pretty wild and crazy, and a lot of people got scammed. And we know that the lack of regulation led to the market crash in 1929, and we know that contributed heavily to the Great Depression. So it was after that folks decided, well, we need some sort of regulation, and the whole concept was this disclosure regime. So if you're selling securities, you need to talk to people about the risks, and so when we have initial coin offerings that are a lot like initial public offerings, that they look like and they talk like and they act like ducks, then we should treat them that way, right? And investors should get some sort of not some sort of, but full disclosure about the potential risks. We've had startup kind of communities all through our history, and we go through these periods. I think the last time we were on the show, Rebecca, we talked about the dot-com, all the dot-coms that came about around the turn of around 2000, and that ended up in the dot-com bubble, and a few people lost significant amounts of funds. So in our economy today, we have a number of startups, and we know from statistics that more than half of those startups always fail. People get excited about a concept, they want to develop it, but they end up failing. I looked at this article just today from Fortune magazine, and they have some stats about ICOs that happened in 2017. And the interesting thing about blockchain and this whole community is everything gets tracked on the internet. There are all these websites. I mean, it's so easy to go out on a website and get information about, you could look up what's the price of Bitcoin right now, and you could probably get half a dozen sites that are going to tell you what the price of Bitcoin is.
It's very transparent.
Yeah. So Fortune looked at some of those sites, and in of the 902 ICOs that they saw in 2017, 59% of them failed or went away somehow. So if we have if we have people, entrepreneurs who are developing the blockchain, and we know that a large percentage of them are going to fail, and they really are, they look like investments, and people are encouraged to invest in those, then we should treat them like securities transactions and require them to give disclosure to investors. So, and what really concerns securities regulators is that, if someone like Warren Buffett wants to invest in an ICO, which I don't think he would.
He's actually said, I'm pretty sure he's not going to.
He's pretty anti,
yeah. So, but if he was, he doesn't need me to protect his interests. He's a smart man. He has a team of analysts. They can figure out whether or not this is a good deal or a bad deal. But the problem is when you get with mom and pop investors, retail investors, people who even may be somewhat smart but are not really financially sophisticated, and they get sort of wrapped up in all the hype and the excitement of the blockchain community now, and they invest their retirement funds in a deal that goes south, and then that's really harmful not only to that individual, but it really impacts on a wider basis people's confidence in investing in anything.
Sure, it can really shake up a whole industry if things are going south for your everyday person.
Right.
Maybe not the Warren Buffetts of the world. Yeah.
No, exactly. We want people to invest in good companies because that helps the companies grow. The companies grow, it creates more jobs, and there's that whole economic development effect. So, but to do that, people have to have confidence that when they do invest in these things, that they are actually investing in something real and not something fake.
Well, and as Forbes reported just today, in Texas, they are finding that fraud among cryptocurrency investment promoters is fairly widespread, and so they've issued a warning. In their finding of 32 cryptocurrency investment promoters investigated in just a 4-week period, at least 5 failed to tell the would-be investors, so more your mom and pop types, about the risks, while guaranteeing returns of up to 40% a month. That's coming from the Texas State Securities Board. So I imagine that this is just on every division, board, everyone's radar screen right now.
And maybe Matt can talk to this a little bit because he's more actively involved in that community. But the sense I get is that the folks in the sort of the blockchain space, they think this is a new and entirely different kind of way of doing things, and that they don't want to be part of a regulatory regime. They're outside of it. It's so innovative. They don't need a regulatory regime, and this notion of complying with both state and federal securities laws is really contrary to the whole notion of what they're doing there.
So how does that differ?
Yeah, so one of the cool things about living in Denver is that I get to meet people who are very active in this space, and I get to exchange ideas with them and find out what they think is important. And just like Jerry said, there's a panoply of views as to whether regulation is appropriate and how much. I would tend to say, though, that the discussions are almost always how much. I do not tend to run into people who say this should just be left to, every
market forces.
Right, every person for himself kind of thing. That is clearly risky for, we have the seminal United States Supreme Court case that gives us what an investment contract is in the Howey case. That's 72 years old. I would put to y'all and to the listeners that human ingenuity is a marvelous thing, but in terms of frauds, it really is pushed to the limits, and that's something that we want people to be aware of. We have to put that information out there because self-regulation would be great. But the reality is that greed takes over, and it has become pathetically easy to issue your own token and call it whatever you want and take money for it and make all kinds of promises you can't fulfill. So hopefully in the future, in the not too far future, the cream will rise to the top in terms of which ICOs really are benefiting your investment.
So what have some other states done regarding legislation and oversight We just spoke about Texas. There's states like Wyoming, but there may be some really wildly differing approaches, I would imagine, among the states and how they're looking at this.
Yeah, I think Jerry and I both have our views on that. I definitely would defer to the regulator on what he believes is the most important developments occurring in the space in terms of enforcement actions. I tend to find that some other innovative approaches, like the Vermont bill that Jerry and I were discussing earlier, where they've actually taken steps to create a new type of limited liability company that is designed to protect minors in the event they are sued as part of what a plaintiff may call a general partnership. Well, a general partnership means that every partner is liable for the debts of every other partner, and potentially your personal assets could be exposed under that kind of regime. So there's a lot of forward-thinking approaches on the business creation side that are really interesting. And I think Jerry, on the ICO side, in terms of what can be done there, I would definitely hand that off to him.
Well, so there's some interesting things going on, and there's a distinction between different kinds of tokens out there, and Matt can help me here a little bit because he's into it. But some tokens are now being called utility tokens. So we know there are tokens that look a lot like securities, and I don't think I've met anyone who thinks that those kinds of tokens should not be regulated, like regular investments should be regulated. But we have this notion of what are utility tokens. And so rather than investing money in a development company and getting an interest in the company, meaning if the company grows, your investment grows, you get some sort of goods or service in exchange for the token. So people sometimes act like, say it's sort of like a coupon or a software license. So you get a token, and it acts like a merchandise coupon where you can exchange your token for, whatever.
Sounds like a great day at Casa Bonita to me. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Or a pound of coffee.
Loyalty programs.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Frequent flyer miles. Same thing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And on the other one, it's just, a software license where you get access to the developer's software that he's developed that you can use for whatever purpose. And so the question is, well, should those be regulated as securities? And clearly the answer is no. I mean, if you go out and buy something, a consumer transaction, you go out and buy a refrigerator, I don't want to regulate that. It's really not an investment product, and people are free to do what they want. But what's going on is that a lot of these ICOs are mixing the two. So they'll mix part utility, so the token will have a utility, and part of it will be an interest in the company. And the question has come up, well, to what extent should regulators be involved in those kinds of transactions? From my point of view, it's a really sticky question. All of this stuff is fact driven. So any ICO we look at, and there are going to be as many ICOs out there as there are creative people, and there are really creative people in this area, and they're going to create a lot of different stuff and put it together in a lot of different ways. And so it's really difficult to come up with a bunch of rules, 5 pages of rules saying in this situation it's a security, and in this situation it's a utility token and not a security, and the Securities Act doesn't apply. What they did in Wyoming was pretty much come up with a bunch of rules and say, if we're going to define utility token, and if it's predominantly a utility token, whatever predominantly means, is it 60-40 or 70-30, then we're going to treat it as not a security, and you're going to be exempt from the Securities Act. And it's based upon the belief of the developer or the person selling it. So I have an opinion about that bill, and I think that the Wyoming bill is really a bad bill. simply because it to me it just opens the door to fraud. And Matt can attest to this. Most of our enforcement cases, including the criminal cases, the fraudsters will go to really a lot of work to disguise it as not being a security. So they know.
Yes.
Yeah. So to avoid having to answer to us. And so they develop this financial product, and they say it's not a security. They put all kinds of labels on it, but when you really look behind the labels, it really is a security. And then they think they can go out and defraud people, scam them, and rip them off, and not have to answer to anyone. And so that I would say a majority of our cases are like that. So my fear is that something like that is going on in Wyoming now. It just opens the door for you to come in and create your ICO and have some very smart people design it so it looks like a utility token, when in fact it's not. And then it creates huge problems for regulators to kind of prove that. Otherwise, kind of break through those labels.
Yeah, you have to really get into the thick of it. And I would imagine then when we talk about Texas that there's a whole different approach happening.
Right. Well, you have to look. That's the uncomfortable reality, is that we're not going to be able to paint with a broad brush with a lot of these tokens, because the problems that they set out to address are so dramatically different in many respects. Now, they have commonalities, like they use a blockchain because, let's say, they're handling large amounts of data. And a blockchain is an unusually effective way to catalog and to store large amounts of data in a way that you can tell if it's been tampered with. And that's one of the great innovations here. But that doesn't matter if there's really no underlying product. And a lot of the ICOs that you see out there, unfortunately, and to some of their credit, I suppose, they tell you this, but that's not supposed to make it, any more appealing to the investor who knows what to look for. Because if what you have is a platform that hasn't been built, and you're asking me for money, and I'm supposed to give it to you on the promise that maybe one day what you said you were going to do is going to come to pass, I mean, that may have been the sort of thing that the earliest ICOs were able to persuade people to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I suspect that as time goes on, it will be less and less the case that, as I said before, the best ICOs are going to be the ones who probably already have a pre-existing business that makes money, and they're just incorporating a token into what they already do. Or they have a really great idea that's pretty far along, and now it's time, because we've already raised all this money over here, now we need to move to the next step. So think of the ICO as basically replacing the Series B in a venture capital round.
So what are some of the actions that have been taken against ICOs to date?
So I'll talk about one because it is really apropos. It's a blockchain called Centra, and they issued a token, and the idea behind it was they were going to develop debit cards and credit cards that you can use with cryptocurrencies. So
not a new idea, by the way.
but it was new here, and so the token sort of entitled you as a way, as I understand it, to pay fees for the credit card and debit cards, where you can buy, you do your cryptocurrency transactions. The people who put it together said they had deals already put together with Visa and MasterCard, and they're long down the road. They raised $32 million for their ICO.
And the name again is?
Centra.
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 Okay.
And so if you looked at the Wyoming bill that was passed in their state legislature a couple months ago, this blockchain offering, this ICO, would be not a security under their law. It would be legal. So on April 2nd, the SEC issued a press release. So the SEC filed a civil complaint against them, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York filed criminal charges against the two people who developed this, because it was a complete fraud. They had developed nothing. They had no contracts with Visa, MasterCard. It was totally a marketing tool to get investors to pony up $32 million. And I can tell you from experience that I bet most of that $32 million is gone, never to come back to the investors.
And I see that just doing a quick search that this was a really highly visible one because it even involved celebrities who were kind of getting on the bandwagon.
Yeah, I think Floyd Mayweather may have some hurt feelings after this one, and a couple others too. I mean, that SEC specifically warned celebrities to be mindful of the promotional activities, because what you're doing is you're lending your fame and your prestige to this project, and if you got money for it, it's all the more a problem for you. But I think the point Jerry makes about the Wyoming bill is important, because it's likely that maybe what they did, it may not have been as illegal as you would think it should be under the Wyoming regime, which is why the federal government was the one who had to ultimately take the enforcement action. But it's an open question whether, having done the same thing in Wyoming, selling only to people in Wyoming, they would have been equally as liable.
Right.
So the interesting thing about Wyoming, in kind of the framework that you're discussing, makes it almost seem like if one state is able to be, a little bit more malleable versus another state, wouldn't that inherently drive people to start their companies in the states or sell their offerings through those particular states? Or is it ultimately all at the federal level? What's the difference between the state and the federal level in terms of the oversight with this type of technology?
So those are two good questions, Rebecca. And I think that the answer to the first one is, even if you create something in Wyoming that's going to draw these developers there, the other folks who are going to come right behind them are the fraudsters who are going to take advantage of it. And that's what happens in this space. So the other thing is that federal law and state law apply to every securities transaction. So even if in Wyoming, if you have an exemption from their Securities Act, you still have to comply with the Federal Securities Act.
Yes.
So there's that double enforcement. But if it's a smaller deal, maybe the SEC doesn't pay attention to it. So.
And fraudsters will look for the weakest regulatory regime. They'll look for states where they're not likely to see any kind of real action against them.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
That is very interesting. We are having a great conversation. We've got a few minutes here. What are we looking at in the future for technologies like these?
Well, Alex, we were talking about Gollum earlier. I think any kind of cryptocurrency and blockchain are really one of the things that is going to create efficiencies in our world as we move forward, I think. And by that I mean what Airbnb did for vacant houses, and what Uber did for those 3 seats in your car that you're not using whenever you're driving down the road. So your platforms like Gollum are going to give you that ability to use spare resources, utilize spare resources that are maybe not being utilized, and others are going to give you the ability to be your own bank. For instance, there's a app out there that's got more than 1 million downloads on the Apple Store called Bread, which is a pretty clever name. And Bread's going to make you your own bank. So,
well, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great. And we have learned a lot of new terms today for our financial literacy encyclopedias. Thank you so much. Check out, again, this podcast and more at cobrt.com/radio. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Alex.
Thank you.